Hello, everyone, and welcome to Cloaked Live. In case you don't know Cloaked, Cloaked protects your personal identity from everyone. And we are extremely active in the privacy space, making sure that you are protected through unlimited generated identities. But for today, we are going to be chatting, as we do, with our CEO, Arjun, and our special guest for today is Ayal, our head of engineering. I'm Veronica Sarin. You can read down here. I am our head of marketing, and we have an exciting conversation for you today, not only covering our own thought leadership on what's going on in the privacy space, but of course, warning you about the breaches that are going on in the space. So another day, another breach. We'll be chatting about that very shortly. But before I dive into that with y'all, Arjun, would love you to share a brief overview of yourself, of Cloaked, and Ayal, same for you.
Yeah, I guess I'll go first, and I'd love to hear from Ayal. My name is Arjun. I'm our CEO of Cloaked. We are a consumer privacy company trying to figure out how to put you in control of your data and your identity. We're super excited about all the stuff coming out this year, and so I think this efforts of how do we keep you up to date on breaches and what's going on in privacy and just generally this whole space security, it's so opaque. So I'm excited to talk more about it every week. And Ayal, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, a little bit about me. So I'm Ayal Spitz. I'm the head of engineering here at Cloaked. I've been doing this I've been at Cloaked for 3 years now. Started off running our mobile group, and now I'm responsible for all of our engineers. So it's been quite the adventure.
So Arjun, most folks know that you are our fearless leader, but I would love to know, Ayal, Arjun, how y'all originally connected and came to be working at Cloaked together.
100%. I think it's always exciting to hear how a founder begins the initial story for the original team, because part of that, it always comes from your network. I think what we have, interestingly enough, dual connections to Ayal. One that Ayal found out later, but from the first part, Ayal actually connected to our chief experience officer, Michael. They worked together in the past, and then he said the first person you got to talk to is Ayal and try to get him convinced. I was like, okay, I want to build out our mobile team, expand Cloaked, and so we got a chance to talk to Ayal, and he can talk about from his perspective, but it wasn't easy at first. Kind of talked to him a few times around what we're trying to do at Cloaked, and then Ayal actually also has similar experience. They weren't at the same time there, but Ayal worked at a company called MITRE, which my co-founder, my brother Abhishek, also worked at MITRE. So an interesting dual relationship there. But yeah, I was really excited about the intro and really happy, obviously, to date. But let Ayal share his side of the story.
Yeah, no, it's kind of funny because Michael started off by introing me to Arjun, as far as I think Arjun was just thinking about departing his previous job. And so Arjun had kind of talked to me. It was more about well, you could potentially come in and maybe fill my role. And I was like, oh, okay. And we discussed it a little bit. And then Arjun, I was like, well, wait, Arjun, why are you leaving your current role? Well, I've got this idea about security and privacy. And I was like, that sounds interesting to me. That I want to.
Oh, actually, I forgot about that. You're talking about you taking my job over. I forgot about that.
Yep. And so when Arjun said that, I was like, oh, I want to hear more about that. He's like, well, I'm kind of working through it right now. I don't know if I have it all, but yeah, let's reconnect. And we connected, as Arjun said, several times, kind of talking about how it would work and so forth, and what did he need as far as help. And eventually he got some funding, and then he's like, yeah, why don't you come on board? So a little more than 3 years ago, I joined up, like I said, to start as the head of mobile, as well as an IC on the iOS product. And at that point, we were 2 and 2. So 2 iOS developers, including myself, and then 2 Android developers. And yeah, then we grew the team. We added, so now we became 6 total. Yeah, 6, and I've kept on going since. So yeah, a lot in the mobile app there for me to start off with.
I actually didn't realize that we first connected on that job part. That's really funny. It's coming back to me now.
Yeah,
I was in the job hunt to try to find my replacement.
It's funny how like a lot of these, as you said, Arjun, a lot of these connections when you're starting a company and when you're bringing everybody together, there tend to be a lot of different wires that connect folks and bring them together. But speaking of wires getting crossed, that's not a very smooth transition on my part. But as I mentioned, another day, another breach. I would love to get both of your takes on the situation with AT&T that happened this week. So I'll read this out right here. And this is from our newsletter. For folks who are listening now who want to sign up for our newsletter, all you have to do is sign up for Cloaked. It is free for the first 14 days. And when you sign up, you will be automatically enrolled in our newsletter. So this data breach, it involves AT&T customer data. Over 70 million files allegedly tied to AT&T and dated back to 2021 surfaced on a cybercrime forum. Charming. Despite claims and counterclaims about the data's authenticity and origin, one thing is clear: it is a privacy nightmare for those affected. So AT&T is in defense mode. This has been out there for a while, it seems. But Arjun, would love to get your take on this.
Yeah, I think whenever you see a data dump, it's always becomes like, where did this come from? Where's the source? And it seems allegedly that it's AT&T. And of course, until it's proven, because they don't want to face any legal implications or the fines, that they're going to say that none of our systems compromised until it's properly proven. And it makes sense. It's like they don't want to take the ownership of it, but it seems like that's the case. And I think when it comes back down to it, it's that same feeling is that there's a new breach. There's on 70 million people. That's probably a bulk of America. I think you think around if you're an AT&T customer, and it's scary to think about. Well, when they're breached, well, what did they do? Well, they got your name, your address, your social security number, your family information, if you got connected accounts, like these type things all come correlated. And when you build a picture across all the breaches, more and more about you is figured out and determined. And I think that's where it gets concerning, scary as well. One breach leads to more and more information about who you are, how to reverse engineer who you are from just one single data point. And I think from my perspective, you don't realize this, but when you're signing up for Comcast, AT&T, they ask you for all this sorts of information. Now, the only one required is SSN to be correct in your name. Everything else you can actually keep faux. I'd really think about how do you give out information that's not the same everywhere when this happens, because it always comes back to bite you.
Yeah, I think one of the basic assumptions a lot of consumers make when they're dealing with these large companies is that, in fact, the folks working there know what they're doing, right? And know how to treat your data well. And I think I don't know if to say it's a false assumption or just you have to be a bit more careful about that, right? You have to recognize that it's usually just people, and that unless they're making a very clear statement about how they handle your data and how, it's stored up, they definitely get, that it could be stored in just plain text, which is kind of scary, right? Because that's what leads to these kind of issues, right? Where somebody just left it in a file. It was easier than, encrypting it and putting it into a database or even thinking a bit more about that. So that's, that's definitely an issue.
So I just jump building on top of that. It always surprises me how passwords and even sensitive data we treat very specifically, but your PII, name, email, phone number, address, we kind of treat as, oh, that's just free information. Feel free to store it in a text document. But if someone stores the password in plain string, everyone's like, no, you did a bad job. And I think this idea of delineation is wrong. I think your PII is as important as your password. It's as important as your username. It shouldn't be in plain text flowing around everywhere. And we're not saying that's partly why it happened, but I think we do know that breaches often happen to lapse of judgment, lapse of controls, some vulnerability, and the fact that any of those things could cause a breach of that size is scary.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, this, we've passed the point, I think, where it's just, I got, as Arjun was saying, I got this, your social security number. Now we're moving to, I'm building a picture of who you are. And taking advantage of that potentially, right? Buying stuff on your credit cards that were taking out in your name, or building credit lines that you never agreed to, or those kind of things. It gets kind of scary, especially when you think some of these companies that, especially when you think that sometimes this information is really building this very clear picture of you, and the resolution of it keeps getting better and better each time more information is added to it. So protecting that is pretty important, especially when you want to control that information.
And my thoughts are on how you actually, like, how you pick information is the biggest key. I think it's twofold. Right immediately, people say change your password. Honestly, I think, yes, you got to do that. But the other main thing is that your personal information is out there. How do you protect yourself? Like, there's two big actions. One, people will try to open up credit cards, try to file IRS tax returns. People will do a lot you don't realize. Try to apply jobs in your name. So things like identity theft protection is pretty important for reactive issues for things like this. But then to prevent this, you got to prevent sharing information. Don't put yourself out there. We talk about cloaked, but even without cloaked, don't be giving the same email, phone number, address, name to everywhere you go, because you don't want that picture, as Ayal describes. That picture is very dangerous because it can compromise you without realizing it.
Yeah, and doing that is really quite effective. I have to say, even before, and one of the things that attracted me to Cloak was I was doing something similar with my own email. I had bought a domain, and then I had my own email addresses. So each company that I went to, it's like, oh, New York Times, here's New York Times at my domain, and so forth. And the moment you saw like, hey, you have to pay this, and it's like, wait, you're not the New York Times, it's like,
Yeah.
no, spam, or, this is somebody attacking my email. So it's like, it suddenly becomes a lot clearer, right? When you're seeing spam, because it's like, no, I'm sorry, my career email box is not where, this vendor would bill me. So nice try. No.
So I guess like just making it very big tactical coming out of this, Ayal. As engineers, what do you think we should be doing to combat the lack of security and data privacy as a society? And obviously there's the obvious for any given person. It's like, hey, keep it cloaked, use cloaked, and if you're not using cloaked, do the things that Arjun was talking about. Change your passwords, two-factor authentication. These things will help even if your information is out there. But from an engineering perspective,
yeah, I mean, I think that for engineers, one of the fundamental issues is really to think about these kind of problems at any level as an engineer, right? Thinking about where is the data that I'm handling going to go? How is it going to be stored? What are we going to potentially do to it or with it? And who actually needs access to it, right? That kind of thinking about these things, even if you're a junior developer, right? You're an IC, an individual contributor, and you're thinking about these things, raising those concerns. At Cloaked, we use zero knowledge storage, right? So everything is encrypted in such a way that even at a company level, we can't look into the data. And I think that's a pretty important element here, right? If you zero knowledge, if you will, I'll just turn it into a verb here, but if you zero knowledge all the data at your company, suddenly only the people who need access, who are supposed to have access, right, can even see that there is data. Forget about the fact that they can't actually see into the data. And so then if somebody breaches that, grabs all that data, in our case, for example, somebody grabbed all our data, it's all encrypted. We couldn't even help you undo that, right? I mean, we can help you in some degree, but it's not like we can't actually open that up for you. You have to have your encryption keys in order to do that. So thinking about these things from a very kind of fundamental level, what is this data? Where is it going to be? Should I see it? Should somebody else be able to see it? Very powerful. When you think about it at that level, you can build everything else on top of it. You get a very solid kind of privacy-minded foundation there, which then helps everything else on top of it. So
I know we want to talk here a bit more about your background, Ayal, and some stories you've had, but I want to kind of just drive that last point home. It's not like when you write. I remember when I first started as an engineer, writing code to all the way where we're leading now. Basic things like permissions, like who accesses different types of objects and systems, like these types of things, engineers should think around. It's like, well, who should be able to see data? And I think that's something that if it's part of the practice, elevates the whole industry.
Yeah, it is. It is really interesting, especially when you start off. Languages like Python and such make a lot of things very simple because they don't necessarily have all these controls. But then, as you kind of mature and you recognize some of these things would be better not to say. And we use Python; it's a fantastic language. But you think about some of these other languages where part of their structure is in thinking about the security. Part of their structure is about making sure things are kind of buttoned down. And
Yeah.
I think that's very powerful as well. It helps in kind of driving further that locking down permissions, not leaving things in text files, right? Leveraging encrypted storage capabilities and so forth. All of that, again, builds up to these beautiful, privacy thoughtful application, I'll say.
Makes sense. Well, I'd like to transition, right? I think from my end, we've always talked more about breaches, but I wanted to kind of talk more about you and your background, Ayal, because I know coming into Cloaked, you brought a wealth of experience. So last week or last time we had our live, we actually had Scott, who we both know pretty well, and he talked a lot about cybersecurity and kind of both his background and his experience in it. But one of the things I love and I think is really interesting, if I was trying to hear something, is around stories and experiences we've learned leading engineering teams. So we're both engineers, have been led a lot of different teams. It's always interesting to see how some lesson you learn or some experience where behind the scenes, what have you actually made possible, had to run around to make possible in order to experience, because often an event of a fire drill or trying to make that happen, event of trying to launch a product or working with customers, each of these different experiences require a lot of creativity. That's not just we had requirements, we built code. And so I'd love to kind of hear from your experience, just something that might be interesting for us to all hear.
Yeah, no, I for me, I think one of my pivotal kind of learning about how to it's not so much deal with customers, but the importance of customers in the equations very much leads back to early time when I was at a company called MITRE, which is research and development for the U.S. government. I was building work.
Which is pretty cool, by the way. I'm a big fan of MITRE.
So MITRE is fantastic. They do a lot of different kind of research, and I had joined too many years to remember now, but I joined and I was doing this Java, which was fantastic at the time. Well, it still is, but we were writing Java apps for the Air Force Weather Group. And I was very kind of green and thought, all right, look, this is awesome. And they have this file and they can do these things. And my manager at the time was looking at it and going, well, this is not really super easy to use. Maybe you should think about how and I'm like, well, if they don't get it, then they're I don't know if I said stupid, but I just like, they shouldn't have it. It's clearly needs some. And he's like, now this was an incredibly thoughtful man that mentored me for years after, but
I'm going to interrupt you. That is painful for me to hear as a marketer.
What was that? Sorry.
The idea of like, oh, well, the user needs to be at the level of what I'm building it at. That's but
that was the thing, right? At the time, I was just like, okay, I'm, software engineer. I know all these things. I am great. And I was very green. And my manager kind of said, hey, okay, so let's learn a little bit more. And I actually got sent out to Saudi Arabia for several weeks to work with these folks in the field. And I actually got to meet these guys, extremely intelligent Air Force folks. It was kind of funny because even getting out there was an adventure. I couldn't get a visa from the consulate, so I had to fly in as a U.S. Air Force captain. And so anyway, bulletproof vest. It was, I'm trying to remember the exact date, but anyway, met these guys, and you discover that they are extremely bright folks. They know what they're doing. They know their job inside and out. They didn't have time for nonsense. So the stuff that I thought like, well, you should know that. It's like, no, sorry, I have a job to do. I need to get this thing done. Your tool does not make it easier, does not make it faster. So I'm just gonna, push it aside. I don't have to use it. I'm not going to. And it was very eye-opening for me. I'm saying like, oh, yeah, these guys have this job to do. This is supposed to be a tool to make it easier for them. Um, okay. And when you kind of land in the field, you're just like, wow, this is reality, right? These guys were living on a base in the middle of Saudi Arabia, and it was kind of like, okay, this is not exactly the front line, but certainly very close. And you're going, all right, so I need to do my job, right? I really need to think about the product, think about how simple it is, right? And that I think is now permeated for me forward as I think about each product that we're building and thinking about how is it in fact that this helps this person, this customer do their job, right? How does it make it easier? What things can I take out of their way so that it becomes that much easier, right? As I said before, one of the things that I had been kind of manipulating on my own was creating a custom domain with emails of my own. That suddenly became so much harder. And when we started this at Cloaked, it was like, oh, yeah, I can make this super easy. Here, let's just, boop, there you go. You've got an email address. There's a new one, right? So
Yeah.
it's like, how do I just, are there steps that I can take out of the process? How do we simplify so that we get to the kind of the core of it? So yeah,
So I have a question around that, Ayal.
yeah.
So as someone who's also gone through a product journey, I still remember my experience when I worked at MIT. We were working on and teaching teachers and students some of the software we built. And I always wonder why my team did this, but it was funny because we still have very technical things in the product and it's meant to use by teachers and students. And we had something that said, save JSON and load JSON. And I was like, I still remember an 8-year-old saying, "Who's Jason?" And like it was still a experience that I always think about that moment. But when you think about building a product and as an engineer, what do you find yourself not doing now? As where before you said I might have done X, but now I'm doing Y instead. What's that change look like if you're thinking about this graduation?
Yeah, so I think a lot of kind of the experience side has driven me to recognize there's like some of the architectural thinking that I used to kind of go, I just start putting it all together and we'll just run with it and see where it takes me. I have since kind of very much gone, okay, let's take a moment, think about this before I start writing code, which is a lot of fun, don't get me wrong, but just think through the problem a bit, kind of roll through it. What are some of the edge cases? What are the things that may come up? What might I need? And then kind of then go and implement. And in some cases, implement even more than is, strictly necessary, but recognizing that experience has taught me, oh, this is going to come up. And so I should, make an accommodation for this now because it's so much easier. Kind of when you're building a house, right? If you lay enough of the right concrete in the right spots, you might not use it all right that second, but it's going to be a lot more expensive later to put down extra concrete pads, to accommodate. So thinking through these things and really kind of taking a moment to go, this is going to come back to bite me. So better take care of it now.
So I want to jump in. If you think about now previously defined user error, what do you no longer call user error and say, no, engineer, that's actually, you have to build like this. Like that's always seems like, what's the fun one that you think about?
The reality is I very much think that very few things are actually user error. Like today, I think very few things, it's very difficult, in fact, in some cases, to think of things as user error. I typically look at them and go, we haven't led you to the right set of actions. Like we haven't led the user to the right thing if they're somehow doing it wrong, right? So there are discussions, disagreements about how you should do X, Y, or Z. But if I haven't given you that path, if I haven't laid out the kind of the breadcrumbs, if you will, to get you to something, then and you can't find it, well, it's not your error. It's my fault for not highlighting it or whatnot, right? It's kind of interesting for me because especially interacting in this case with my dad with the iPhone, there are definitely things where he's like, well, where is this hidden? And you're like, hey, you're right. No, it's hidden, but if you knew that you should swipe, then it should. So it's like, how do I lead you there so that you know that these things are there? And I think that's something that we try to do, as I look at like the Cloak product. It's like, how do we simplify this? How do we lead you to the right kind of results that we're expecting you to get to? But it's just as interesting to see, what is it that you get to? Okay, let's think about that. So
well, it's funny you say that around how do you actually like guiding towards user, seeing where they act. If you tie it back to our world and Cloaked, there's a lot of stuff we do, but just even talking about basics, fundamentals, I think about passwords and even two-factor authentication as I have my own commentary. I want to hear your thoughts as duct taped user error filled design, where sorry, your password is not uppercase, lowercase, has a symbol, minimum 8, and then if you're like even a bank, some of my bank, even my own personal bank, they actually mandate the password is less than 12 characters, which is wild. How do you kind of reconcile some of these things? Like, what should we be doing? The other one I think around fun is like two-factor authentication. I can go on and on about that, but I'd love to hear your thoughts around so many things in the world of security that we should be designing differently, thinking in mind user error versus what's best.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I never enjoyed the whole race to fill out passwords, longer, more characters, more confusing. I think, it was a kind of an initial good cut at things, but it's become clearer that people just can't manage the size of a password that it has to be, with the complexity of it. I mean, in the Cloaked app, we actually have a password generator, right, as part of the tool. And the number of levers that you can push about mixing characters and numbers and symbols, it's clearly way too much for most people, right? And so that's where you end up with people replicating passwords, using the same password everywhere, whatnot. I think that, my eyes, certainly MFA has proven itself, right? The two-factor authentication has proven itself quite successful. But even there, we now see attacks on, SIM spoofing and so forth to get at that information. So I really would love to see us moving even further forward to things like passkeys, right? Which is key pairs of public and private keys, as well as even further. I know that, for example, Google leverages hardware keys. So you have to have a hardware key to go on with that. The challenge is really in ensuring that kind of technology is stable, capable, so that, it's a smooth experience for the user, but also making sure that what happens if you lose that key, for example, right? Let's say we go to hardware keys. It's fantastic until you lose the hardware key. So that's where you need to have two of them, and you need to think through these kind of problems, right? But to your point, it's very frustrating when you know about this technology and then you go to your bank and you're like, so you're using it? And they go, no, we have a password. And you kind of go,
well, I find it funny is that I think we're inventing new technologies that have their own problems as opposed to kind of tackling some of these things at its core. Like my problem with MFA is that I feel that it's just a duct tape around the problem. Well, password isn't good enough, so it's duct tape another solution. For all the critique I have on Google around privacy, I say they're stellar in terms of security, right? They want to make sure that nobody takes their data. Yeah. But Google hilariously has an authenticator app, and they don't use authenticator. They don't use MFA because they've designed a system that makes more sense. They say, oh, is your phone near you? We're going to check to see your phone's near you. You push a little number, these types of things, where I like that they approach security in a bit more intuitive way. I can't say about anything else at Google, but I think that's, at least I've always found that that's a better approach to some of these problems.
This, to some degree, this is like when you go to your doctor's office and he's recommending laser surgery and he's wearing glasses, and you kind of go, do you know something that I don't know? Yeah, no, I mean, I've been on teams that have been connected to Google, and they insist on using the hardware keys, and that seems a very solid solution, leveraging, the secondary device as kind of authentication, also very effective solution. It's just getting everybody to use this technology, right? There's, in some cases, banks, they're very big. They move very slowly, I think, as we know. And so it's like, okay, but you could do it. We could be more secure. It's like, well, we have to review and think. And So, we're trying to push the envelope in our tech as much as we can,
Well,
to
I
address
think
it the best we
about
can.
this idea of change. I was curious around things that always happen the way they are. I always talk about, at least from where we are, we think about blockchain. Now we're talking about Web 5 versus Web 3. It's like, how do you create meaningful change as an engineer today when you're working at any company? Like, I just laugh about, I have a friend who works at a company. I don't want to reveal too much information, that they do all their calculations using a MATLAB app that they wrote.
Hmm.
This is like a hundreds of millions dollar company and a MATLAB app calculating some things. And I think around, well, how does an engineer come in and provide some form of change that makes sense, or do they not?
Well, I think with some of the bigger companies, it's challenging, right? I mean, that in fact is probably why my career has mostly spiraled to smaller and smaller, right? Landing at Cloaked as really being one of the very early folks at the company. But I was at Accenture, where you have, I think at this point it's a massive company. I mean, worldwide offices, consultants everywhere, and it's challenging. It's challenging to try to turn that boat, to shift that Titanic of a vessel. And I think it's often that you have to prove some of these things out in smaller, like a smaller company, or in kind of a stealth little, if you will, skunkworks kind of effort to kind of bring these things to fruition. I mean, even the iPhone was a skunkworks project within Apple before it actually, like, oh, let's build iPhones. It was actually an iPad, but it's like there was a skunkworks and these guys were kind of thinking about it. And then it was
It's
like, oh,
funny
look.
you say skunkworks, because or even like what I relate that back to is my own experience. I remember I was an iOS engineer at a company. I was doing iOS and C# backend, and I remember inheriting the code base, and I was like, "Holy cow, this is disgusting." And then but I remembered, you know what? Like the metaphor, there's like the flower grows through poop. I was like, okay, this is all disgusting, but at least what I'm going to start putting is wherever I touch, I'm going to make it look nicer and feel better and be smarter about
And
decisions.
that's,
I'm
seeding.
hoping, right?
Yeah, and that's often an effective, method, seeding kind of this knowledge to others, seeding tech in different spots where you can, right? Actually adding to, and so like when I was at Accenture, part of the effort there was introducing folks to the bigger kind of, from what was Intrepid to bigger Accenture, seeding those folks into the company. Now, you have to expect it to take a very long time to grow, and you have to be prepared to wait. But if you're willing to, you can seed these, that then turn into trees, that fruit trees and so forth. So very, it's a tactic, right? That's one tactic, or doing a startup, right? Starting
Yes.
up your own company, you get the
can
drive,
leave and try something new. Yeah.
and then you get full control of it. So yeah.
So I know we're a little over time, but all of that was very interesting to go into, especially because it relates to how are we solving the problem and how are we building toward a solution. But last but not least, would love to just give you each the floor of what last thought you would like to leave our audience with today.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to go first?
Yeah, you go first, Ayal.
Oh, okay. Put me on the spot. I think it's just very much that folks should be thinking about kind of their privacy in the large, right? It used to be, as I think we've said, right? It used to be that you worried about the password, or you worried about your username, or maybe it's your email, but it really is that kind of tapestry of information about you, right? It's all that information joined together, which scarily then starts like directing algorithms at you. I looked up a book the other day on Google, and suddenly it's showing up in my Facebook, and I'm like, how did this happen? Right. So thinking about how do you manage your privacy, how do you disconnect the data between these different pieces, very much leads you to kind of this deeper thoughts about, hey, we should really think about all of this, and what are the tools available to me to help in making that happen, to control it.
Definitely.
Well, Ayla gave me a pretty nice transition to what I wanted to close out with. I no, I don't think anyone else does this, but I spent the weekend reading a bunch of peer research studies on privacy for fun, catching up in the last few years, and I was reminded about the great problem that face anybody who enters our industry. It's called the privacy paradox. This idea that people actually want privacy. The problem is that we don't see the amount of action that equates to demand and desire. And so I think, like, how do you take that on? And it came down to this idea around the real reason we struggle with this is because there's no meaningful choice or action you can take. And then when you see the AT&T breaches the world, you get numb. You don't know what to do. It's like, well, that's all I can do. I think for me, the one thing I've been really wrestling with and really reconciling is that privacy does not need to be an absolute. It's an ever growing thing that you can keep doing, and even small actions make an impact. I don't care that every single day, whether it's TikTok or YouTube asks to access my contacts, I say no. And I think this type of mentality, if somebody just texted me during this meeting and said, "Oh, can I share your number with somebody else?" And all my answer is, give them this number instead. Please don't give my actual number to some random person I don't think I'll ever connect with. And so we can make meaningful actions. It just takes a slight shift. And if you can give tools that are simple enough, people will be able to do it time and time again, make things better. But that's where I was like, take one small action. It makes a big difference.
Awesome. Love to see it. All right, folks.
All right.
For all those who have tuned in today, thank you for your time. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. We will have another LinkedIn Live later this week, which will feature Lucas, our head of customer success here at Cloaked. So until then, we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Thanks, Ayal.
Thanks, everyone.